I'm Greg. I'm one of the members of our social mixed reality team here at Mozilla. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Hubs, which is an app that we launched an early preview of at the end of April earlier this year. And so what Hubs is a web VR application that you can go to now at hubs.mozilla.com. And it allows you to meet with other people together through the web in mixed reality. So if you were to go to hubs.mozilla.com, this is what our landing page looks like. You can choose a scene and give your room a name, and then just hit in one click, and you'll be redirected to a URL to enter your room. And then you just can take that URL and share it with someone, and then when they open it up, the next thing you know, they'll be in a room with you as an avatar. And so here you can see I'm in a room with Jim and Sarah here, and we have the ability to move around the space. We can hear each other talking, and if we have mixed reality headsets, we can actually use WebVR to go in and see each other and make eye contact and be able to spend time together in the virtual space. Hey guys. We can also pick up objects. So we have these rubber ducks in there that you can pick up and throw around if you have 6DoF tracking, especially. It's kind of fun. And so this is what Hubs is all about. And so I'm going to jump right into a really intense on-stage VR demo. So just let me grab my headset. All right, never mind. I'm just kidding. So if I've learned anything over the years doing this stuff, that doing a VR demo on stage is not only kind of tricky, but also a pretty poor way to convey what it's like to do social mixed reality. And so I just encourage you to go to hubs.mozilla.com to check out the app. And if you can even check it out now on your phones. I just ask you to keep your speakers low because you might get feedback from your voice and so on. But that's where it's at. So and so as I was working on this talk, over time it kind of evolved. And I kind of decided that what I'd like to talk to you guys about is why are we working on this? And I could kind of go into our OKRs and what the market looks like and partnership opportunities. But I think I want to go even a little bit higher level. Why is this work important? Why do we think that it will be valuable for the world? And why are we doing it here as Mozilla? Why do we have this team dedicated to working on this stuff here? And so I think to help convince you that this is something we should be doing, I think I'd like to try to get you to start to believe three things by the end of this talk. So the first is that VR and AR devices, mixed reality devices, will be about getting people to be together through the internet. And that it'll be looked back on as that being the major contribution that these devices actually gave to society. The next idea is that users will choose the web as the way to get together in mixed reality if a good option exists on the web for them to do so. And the third is that Mozilla has a unique role and must play a leadership role in this space and to get us kind of on a better track, because I think I'll talk more later towards the end of the talk why I think that's necessary. And so I'd like to dive into the first point, so that mixed reality devices will be kind of looked back on as being a thing that fundamentally allowed us to be together through the internet. And so I'd like to kind of start with some simple shapes. So here we have two rectangles. And so we can fill these rectangles in, and these are things you probably recognize. Generally today our communication tools, other than audio, are basically small rectangles that are dynamic images. So they're just small rectangles, and the main capacity they have is to create dynamic images. And so when we want to communicate with one another, we're typically doing it behind the screen of one of these rectangles, and we're typically doing it at a far distance. And so that distance kind of creates a wall between us. I can't see the person, I can't interact with them directly, I kind of have to interact with them through this tiny rectangle. And so we kind of have to bust a rectangle-shaped hole through the wall of distance here to be able to communicate. And my goal is to kind of mess around with what's on my rectangle so that it affects your rectangle, and then I have to guess what you're thinking based upon how I manipulate that. And so I think fundamentally this is the world we live in now, which is this world of rectangle-mediated communication. And so I'm going to talk more about how I think this might change. So to take a step back, here we are all at All Hands in San Francisco, and I think it's kind of an interesting opportunity to ask why did we come here? What's the reason? And obviously it's like really expensive for us to all take flights. There's a lot of sacrifices we've had to make, both in terms of leaving family or your context switching out of work we're doing. And so why is this so valuable that we're willing to trade all that in exchange for being here at All Hands? And so I think fundamentally it's about being in a space together. I think that kind of sums it up in a single sentence. But I think we should first unpack what we mean by together. What does that actually mean? So, I mean, when you're texting with someone on your phone, are you kind of together with them? If you're kind of staring at each other through your video call, is that being together? If you're in World of Warcraft or in an avatar in a 3D game, are you together then? And so I think this is actually a pretty complex question. And so researchers actually have a term for this sense of being together, and they call it social presence. And so that kind of is a term used to just encapsulate the idea that there's this feeling of being together with other people. And so, social presence is the kind of thing that there's not like a singular definition for it. You can kind of like quantify it different ways, you can talk about it different ways, but none of those are really perfect. You can kind of just look at it from different angles and kind of know it when you see it. So I think one way to look at it is that social presence is kind of benched against face-to-face communication. So face-to-face communication is kind of considered to be the control in research for the best kind of social presence you can get. That's the gold standard. And all other communication means that we have for remote communication are benched against their ability to deliver parity with face-to-face communication. And so what researchers will do is, if they want to experiment on a new type of communication medium, they'll have a study group, and then they'll ask them a bunch of questions that are meant to kind of tease out the sense of social presence those folks had when they were using that medium. And so that can be distilled down to a series of scores, and now you can start to try to compare apples to apples between different types of communication. Another way to talk about social presence is to just kind of try coming up with different definitions for it. So there's this one of the feeling of being together. Another one I really think is interesting is it's the feeling of non-mediation. It's the idea that when we're with one another, when I talk to you, I don't have this kind of mental model that there's some hidden elf kind of transmitting my words to you in your ear. It's just kind of taken care of automatically by reality that we live in. And so if we're talking about remote communication, where there is going to be some kind of intermediary, that kind of means that to deliver social presence through the internet, there needs to be a mechanism to create the illusion that you do not have an intermediate mediator for that kind of communication. And so I think, if we go back to our rectangle-mediated communication model that we live in today, now let's say that we put VR headsets or AR headsets on our pair of people here. What kind of can happen, right? So the first thing that I think happens is that the rectangles just kind of immediately go away, because even if you take a consumer VR headset today with good tracking, you can feel like you're in a different place when you put that on. Your head tracking is there, you get stereoscopic rendering, you can really kind of be transported away to feel like you're in a different place. But now let's get even more clever with this illusion. Let's start networking state between these two folks so that they actually are kind of tricked into thinking they're actually near each other and physically co-present with one another. And that's doable too. Now we can actually create a new virtual space that they both share. And this includes not just the room they're in, but also the objects and the things that they can see. And so there's this like visual co-presence they can have when they're in VR and AR together. And then if we get really, really good, we can actually get the comfort level high enough for the hardware and the software, our frame rate really, really good, our graphics really good. We avoid a lot of the pitfalls of the uncanny valley. And now they might even forget that they're even in a headset at all. They might just feel like there's nothing intermediating any of this communication. And now we finally arrived at illusory non-mediated communication, meaning there's this illusion that's taking place that makes people feel like there's no intermediary, and it's delivering this high sense of social presence. So to go back to why are we physically here in San Francisco, and I think one way to think about it is we're here to take advantage of all the kind of free features that physical face-to-face communication just gets you out of the box. And so if we go back to that kind of sentence, to be in a space together, I think there's two kind of features that fall out. So the first is, by being in a space, we have this automatic sense of shared situational awareness. So if I point at that banana on that table over there, and everyone else looks at it, there's no kind of sense that you'll not see the banana because we all can just automatically, our senses will give us the same information. So that's shared situational awareness. And then being together gives us that social presence feeling that I mentioned, that sense that we can communicate without any intermediary kind of doing that for us. So when we have these two features, like I think fundamentally the reason we come here is when we get those features, we feel that those allow us to collaborate more effectively. They allow us to strengthen our relationships with one another. They allow us to make progress on the goals we have collectively. And ultimately, these are the things that cause us to so highly value this face-to-face communication. So basically, these are the two features we really need to unpack if we want to understand how can we deliver that without having to physically fly to the same place. And so the question is face-to-face the only way to actually get these features? So let's create this axis here. So on one side, we've got our kind of standard text-based, rectangle-based tools that we use to communicate. And then on the other side, we've got the gold standard, the face-to-face sense of shared spatial awareness and social presence. So an obvious question to ask is, given especially that we use it so much, where does video conferencing fall on this spectrum? And so I think often we immediately think, well, video conferencing isn't that great because there's all these technical problems that come up, like I can't hear you, or the video's choppy, or your internet dropped out, and those are all totally legit. But I think I want to not drill into those too much. I think we should talk about the deeper issues with video conferencing that I think result in you feeling kind of like let down by the end, that it didn't really deliver on the promises. And so if we go back to this rectangle-mediated communication model, at the end of the day, the only real thing we can do here is just kind of tweak the pixels we show each other through these rectangles. So there's kind of a hard ceiling on what we can actually expect to be able to do. I mean, all you're doing here is you're just throwing another rectangle inside the first rectangle with a face in it. And so, at the end of the day, like, what do you really expect to change inside of the mental state of another person? There's obviously potential for some change, but there's really not that much that you could really expect versus the model where you radically shift the way people feel like they are with one another. And so I think visibility, namely seeing your face when you talk to someone through the internet, and social presence, feeling like you're with a person through the internet, these are not the same thing. Video conferencing falls short of delivering social presence for a variety of reasons. One that I could drill into a little bit is just the ability for you to do turn taking. So I'm sure you guys have all experienced this, but on video conferencing, normally what would have been a dynamic back and forth becomes this very kind of different dynamic where you never really know when the right cue is for you to kind of hop in and get your say what you want to say to the point being made. So you just don't. And then what happens is it's kind of these long segments of one person talking at a time, and then maybe if you're lucky there's like a time at the end to kind of do some Q&A. But ultimately that dynamic turn-taking thing that we're used to in face-to-face communication isn't there. And so the net result of this is that research has shown that, especially for things like problem solving and collaboration, physical manipulation of objects, adding the ability to see a person's face doesn't add a whole lot. It doesn't really bring much benefit to successfully completing these tasks. And so I'd argue that visibility, seeing a person's face, doesn't really imply necessarily that you're getting that social presence. And so if we're being honest, where these lie, I think, on this spectrum, is they definitely fall clustered on the left. Maybe a little bit more to the right, but, because, there's obviously cases where video conferencing is great, like, my mom loves to see her 8-month-old grandson through FaceTime, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be as good as face-to-face for, like, dynamically solving problems together. So I think that's kind of where those land. And given our kind of the reliance upon these tools and the fact that we're a distributed company, this could be a little bit unsettling because, we're trying to solve complex problems together, and it's really good that we do get together like this. And I think, but we should be very, very aware that video conferencing definitely is putting a limit on, in terms of, has its limits with regards to how well we can collaborate through it. So the next question is, where does social VR land on this? Where does this new medium kind of come in? And so, does it end up being another incremental improvement on top of video conferencing? Is it kind of a nice jump, but not quite all the way? Or is it competitive with face-to-face? And so, these are the features we need to really drill in on. Like, can we deliver these without having to physically be near one another? And so subjectively, I can kind of go through some reasoning why you might think that could be done. So shared situational awareness, for example, when you're in a VR space with other people, you have a shared frame of reference. So, you can both obviously understand that I can point and show you something and we both agree it's the same. We can use simplified language. So I can, instead of having to describe every detail, I can say, can you move that over there? And it's, just explained very clearly. And we can also put state into the world. So I can move objects around, I can draw, and I can embed ideas and knowledge into the world. And so all this kind of adds up to a kind of radically different ability to deliver shared situational awareness in social VR and AR. Now, social presence, I think, also there's a lot of reason to believe that this can happen. So in social mixed reality, you can move around. You have locomotion. You have spatialized audio. People tend to be able to self-organize and break up into groups and have separate conversations. That turn-taking dynamic I mentioned with video conferencing starts to become a lot more like real life, where I can kind of get a sense like, are you about to take a pause because your body starts to react, and I can jump in and add my 2 cents. And then body language is a huge thing that comes through in social mixed reality. So because of the fact that we have head tracking and soon eye tracking and hand tracking, you get all this nice body language that comes through that you don't get in other media. I can know very, very clearly what you're looking at, so I can kind of know what to talk about because you're focused on it. There's all this back channeling that happens where I can tell your level of comprehension because of the way you act, or the lack of comprehension because of the way that you kind of look a little bit confused. All this kind of comes through just with a little bit of body tracking pinned to an avatar. And so hand gesturing is its own kind of big thing that happens in social mixed reality if you can do it. Obviously, there's things like pointing that you can do, which have a huge benefit. But you can also start to use your hands to do iconic representations. I'm sure my hands have been doing all kinds of stuff up here on stage, and that can all come through. And that's a really powerful way to communicate as well. So that's like a kind of subjective analysis. If you use social VR, you'll kind of intuitively understand that those are all possible. But are there ways to know, right, how close we are? And so Oculus Research actually just published a study back in April of this year that tried to start to tease this out a bit with modern consumer VR hardware. And so what they did was they had pairs of people try to accomplish some simple tasks around moving some objects around. And they did it first physically in face-to-face, real life. And then they did the same thing, and they modeled it out in VR, and they put them in there as avatars, and they did it embodied in VR, basically the same task. And then the third thing they did was they did the same task in VR, but they took the avatars away. So people basically could only talk to each other like they were on a phone call, but they lost the ability to see where each other was, they lost the ability to see their body language. And so this was when they were not embodied in VR for the same task. And so then they did all these tests, and then they went back and they surveyed people using those factors that I mentioned to be able to measure quantitatively what level of social presence people had in each of those 3 scenarios. And amazingly enough, the factor analysis showed that for all but one, there was no statistical difference between the social VR and the face-to-face communication. And so this is just one study, but this is like one of the first ones that's using like modern consumer hardware. And it's kind of striking if this holds up and is replicated, because inductively you can kind of imagine now maybe we're finally at the point where research on remote communication is starting to show parity with face-to-face. If you go back and read research in video conferencing time and time again, it's like nope, nope, nope. But this is like actually showing early signs that this is actually getting pretty darn close. And so this is a really important, I think, conclusion. So another thing that you could kind of, if you really want to drink the Kool-Aid, if you believe all that, is could this actually become better than face-to-face? So maybe like, even if we were physically here, we would all throw on VR headsets or AR headsets to do this. And so would that mean that this ends up being even past the end of the spectrum here? And I'm not going to say I know the answer to that. I kind of think it's true, but I think there's early signs to kind of point us and see a glimmer that this could be the case. So, for example, in this Oculus study, people actually preferred the VR version of this, the embodied VR version of this, over the real-life one. And when they started to ask them why, and that people say, well, I could be more myself. I felt like there was less anxiety and pressure on me. And so this ability for mixed reality communication to start to allow you to open up a bit more and things like this, I think are like these things that anecdotally, I think those of us that have worked on this have seen this happening, and it actually is, I think, an early sign that people may just find themselves drawn to this medium for communication because it allows them to express themselves better. And so this was the first point I wanted to cover, was that mixed reality devices, I think, because of their ability to finally rival face-to-face communication on shared situational awareness and social presence, actually are going to ultimately be viewed as being their main contribution is that they can allow people to be together through the internet. And I think we all realize kind of intuitively, but empirically too, face-to-face communication is highly valued by society. There's this U.S. Department of Energy research that shows that approximately 8% of U.S. energy is spent on physically moving human bodies around so that you can actually be next to each other for face-to-face communication. So that's a pretty crazy statistic. And so this is kind of the point where I want to look back at this in 5 years and ask myself if this was a silly claim to make or not. But I think I'm going to claim that an ubiquitous medium for creating instant shared situational awareness and social presence between arbitrary people on Earth will have similar impact as the ubiquitous internet connectivity that we're seeing spread across the Earth as well. I think when you can just snap your fingers and feel present with another human being, regardless of where they are or who they are, that's a pretty profound change. And so that's why I think that these devices, ultimately, that will be the thing people say were the main contribution. So that was the first thing I wanted to try to convince you of. Hopefully I did a good job. So the next one is that if this medium is viable and ends up being that if there is a good choice for people to do this kind of communication on the web, then they'll choose the web to do it. And so this is a snapshot of kind of what the ecosystem looks like right now for social VR. And so these are all native applications. The majority of them use commercial closed source game engines. And so none of these are inherently built on the web. Some of them use the web as a way to bring content in, but fundamentally there's no from the ground up built web-based social mixed reality application other than the one we're working on, as far as I know. And so if you really believe that this is true, that in the long run this is going to be what this medium is all about, then I think there's a few things we can kind of expect users to either directly or kind of just indirectly migrate to if the opportunity presents itself. And so the first thing I think users are going to migrate to is the platform where there's the maximal successful probability that co-presence can be established between two arbitrary people. And so what I mean by that is that if we have two people, Alice and Bob, and they get to a point, whether it's through email or through a phone call or something like that, that they realize they want to meet in mixed reality, now there's this success and failure funnel they have to get through. They basically need to successfully establish co-presence. And that's not necessarily high social presence. This is earlier than that. They just need to be able to have a socket effectively connecting them through the internet for the purpose of escalating them up to being in a room together in a virtual reality medium or mixed reality medium. And so this is we call logging in together. And so this is a 0 or a 1. They either get through it and they're connected or they're not. Now the reasons they might not be able to connect include things like somebody doesn't have the right hardware, or they can't agree on the right app to use, or they need to become connected on some social graph first and they can't figure out how to do that, or they don't want to do that. So there's a million reasons this can go wrong. And then there's also different activation costs, whether it's the first time they're doing this or the subsequent times. And I would really emphasize that first time cost, because you basically have to prove that the entire funnel works. And so this first time cost is critical to being really, really easy. If you want an arbitrary set of people to be able to get into this medium together. And so they need to do this with minimal prior coordination. There shouldn't be a lot of back and forth knowledge needed or back and forth coordination needed to converge on being co-present. And so obviously, we think, and it's kind of crazy to think that this is a unique idea, but clicking a link and opening it up, being a way to just immediately have people be co-present, we think is the right model for this. Now that's not how these other applications that are kind of in the space work. They generally require a decent amount of constraints being considered or ways to coordinate entry, installation steps, friending steps. So it gets very complicated, and so I think that all adds to friction and limits the ability for people to get co-present. And so with Hubs, it's one click, as I mentioned, to create a room, and then you share the link, and then it's 1 or 2 clicks to get in, depending on if you need to check your audio setup first. And our goal as the creators is to make it so that for everything that we can do in the browser, to ensure that it just works, right? The mental model people should have is that when I send you a link, you will be there. You will get in. And so that's kind of a design principle we have, and I think that's a prerequisite to being able to build on this medium. So the next area that I think users will naturally migrate to, if it exists, is the platform that maximizes their social presence with one another, that concept we talked about with being together. And so, I think we often think about maximizing the social presence to be about kind of, if they have a high-end headset, render it this way. They have a low-end headset, render it this way. But I think there's a lot of things that actually need to be taken into account to actually really deliver the maximal or social presence for somebody. You need to take into account their physical abilities and their physical context. Are they sitting? Are they standing? Are they in a big room? Are they in a small room? And then also the application context. Are they in a specific situation in the app where we know we can dial up or down certain things to deliver more or less social presence? And so I think, from an engineering side, we often think of this as about, to get the maximal social presence, we just have to be cross-platform, we have to be cross-device, we have to understand all that. But I think this is actually the wrong language to talk about this concept. I think instead it should be more about responsiveness. It should be more design language and less engineering language. Responsiveness today on the web is about fundamentally enabling access to content. Regardless of your particular rectangle's aspect ratio and size, you will get a view into content on the web. And so I think that responsiveness now also will be similarly applicable to social presence. So whatever particular context you're in, whether it's a headset or a phone device, whether you're on the train or in a quiet room, all these factors need to be taken into account to respond to the ability for the app to deliver high level of social presence. And so the goal is to maximize the level of illusion that we can deliver to you, that there's no mediator in your communication in a context-sensitive way, where there's ever-evolving capabilities and context over time. So that means both the device ecosystem is changing, obviously, but when you're using the app, how you're using it minute by minute is changing as well. And so I think building responsiveness into the platform is kind of a natural place for the web to help. And so, we're using WebVR and we're using all the typical things that you get in the browser to be responsive with regards to devices and so on, and various different configurations a user might have. But fundamentally, our design goal is to be responsive to maximizing social presence. And by being on the web, I think that's going to just be the natural path. Whereas if you're on a different non-web platform, you have to kind of step back and really, really think about how you're going to do that. There's not a whole lot you can draw on culturally and technically to kind of lead you in that direction. And that's why I think a lot of these existing platforms don't have this, wide spectrum of support out of the box typically. So the last thing I think that makes the web attractive and being the platform people will migrate to is they'll be looking for the thing that will maximize adaptability to communicate in this medium. And so to steal a line from Larry Lessig, code is law. So when we're talking about software that controls human behavior and regulates human behavior, it actually acts like a regulator in the way a government regulator would. It kind of constrains what kinds of things you can do and say and think. And so when you move into 3D and VR and AR, code and content is law. And in fact, I think another way to think about this is you end up bringing in game design, right? So game design is its own form of imposing constraints on people to kind of induce certain behaviors in them. But all of this kind of wraps up into the fact that the bits you're sending and the content and code you have induces behavior in people and actually puts in law and constraints in what they can do. And so, just a throwback example, if you go back to the original Quake, this is an example of level design where to choose your difficulty, you had 3 doors filters you could go through. There's probably not a whole lot of C code driving those choices. It's just level design. It's just game design. And all of this kind of game design thinking comes through when you start working in social mixed reality. And so I think the right medium for this and the right platform for this must be easy to change in response to bad laws or bad constraints. There's going to be people that just don't like the constraints and the laws that were laid down, whether it's due to the way the level is laid out or the way the code works, the way it enforces certain ways for you to communicate. There's going to be a need for people to be able to bust through the different constraints that are there, intentionally or not. And so, the open web turns out to be, I think, the best platform, both culturally, technically, just the way things work, that's a conversational medium that's open and amenable to these types of changes so that somebody can basically look at something and decide they want to go their own way, and there's like a pretty well-defined path for them to do so. And so for Hubs, we're doing all the things you'd expect. We're open sourcing our code, we're open sourcing our infrastructure, and we're also, our roadmap for the remainder of the year or so is to basically try to accelerate the ability for people to adapt what we've worked on to their own needs, all with the intention of being able to create this maximal adaptability of social mixed reality on the web. And so, I think users, if they have an option to, they'll choose the web for those reasons. There's these three big things that they're going to be looking to maximize, and they might not even be consciously thinking about it. There might just be gates that they can get through using the web that they would fail to get through on other platforms. And so, using link sharing, having a responsive methodology to maximizing social presence so they get the best sense of being with people regardless of context, and making it so that they can riff and change the thing to be what they want. I think those are all key things that make the web uniquely positioned to be the best platform. So the third thing I wanted to try to convince you of is that Mozilla has a role to play here, and I think must lead us towards a potentially different future. And this is kind of the part of my talk where the storm clouds kind of roll in, and if you're not feeling a little bit uneasy by the end of this, then I didn't do my job. So I think fundamentally we're on the wrong track with this stuff, and it's kind of sad to say, but I think that we are. And so I could probably sum this up in a single slide, but I probably should dig in a little bit more than this. So as I mentioned, this is the ecosystem now, and so these are all native apps, and it'd be great if they were on the web. Some of these guys have things running in the browser a bit. But I could still sleep at night, like if it turns out we're not running on the web. I think it's the best platform. I think users will choose it, but it's not something that kind of freaks me out. But I think there are things that do freak me out as far as what's going on right now. So I'd like to talk a little bit about privacy, identity, access, and design that is falling out of the ecosystem right now. So let's start with privacy. So as I mentioned, social presence is this thing that comes out from delivering a good illusion that there's non-mediation in your communication. Well, so that implies two things. That implies there is a mediator that's delivering the illusion, and then there's an illusion. It's basically the job of the mediator to trick you into believing that there's no mediator. So how does that illusion take place? Well, there's a lot of really, really smart people working really, really hard to, as fast as possible, deliver tons and tons of technical hardware and software capabilities to maximize this illusion as fast for as many people as possible. And so the way to break this down is are these systems over time are being designed and created so that there's two key capabilities. They have full bodily awareness, so they know the entire state of your body, and then that's your outputs, so they know all your body's outputs. And then they have full sensory injection capability, so they can control all the inputs. And they're starting with eyes and ears, obviously, but there's been talks by Oculus about how are they going to do smell in 20 years, right? So this is kind of the goal. And so I think one mental model that might be useful that I kind of came up with is there's this body proxy that's slowly kind of emerging, where there's going to be this proxy. It's going to be a mix of hardware and software, and your body is going to be basically sitting between this proxy. And yeah, today it's like kind of obvious, but like I think eventually you won't even know it's there probably. So if we go back to social presence, this is about delivering this illusion. So the level of social presence presumably is somewhat proportional to the goodness of the illusion. And the illusion is proportional to the ability of this body proxy to really do a good job. Like, it really needs to know everything about what you're doing, and it needs to be able to override your senses as best as it can. Now, if you assume that the first thing I tried to convince you of is true, that we're going to, over time, start to choose to use remote mixed reality communication to interact with one another, potentially in a semi-exponential way, if this really is like a lot better, which we'll see, but it could be that be the case. This ends up meaning that we're going to have an ever-increasing proxying of human interaction, globally, probably, eventually. And so, you know, it sounds a little bit far-fetched, but like all the pieces are kind of emerging. And so this ultimately is obviously a privacy nightmare, right? I mean, it's hard to think of worse. So I think, I know it's bad form to read off of slides, but this is really important to me, so I'm going to just read it as is. So I think structures which incentivize behavior modification, like ad-based business models, should be avoided in this space, given the unique and unprecedented power these systems can wield over their users' minds and bodies. This kind of software ought to be auditable for that kind of behavior modification mechanism or other abuses of this body proxy that's being built around people that these systems are going to introduce. And so unless these are audited, I think it's the case that software which actually performs weird behavior modification or other things may actually be indistinguishable from that which doesn't. So, you know, no matter whatever company says they do in terms of their privacy policy, and they have these boards of people that make sure everything is good, from outside, you're not going to be able to tell a lot of the time if they're actually rewriting your brain. But we'll see. So for Hubs, you know, we've taken a privacy-centric approach from the beginning. We agonize over every piece of information that we transmit and every piece of information that we potentially could store. We've open sourced all the code and infrastructure, and if we're doing anything where we're storing state we don't need or we're tracking information we don't need, it's a bug. You know, we have a short, easy to understand privacy policy, and we hope that we can kind of provide a counterexample to like why this medium doesn't inherently have to be about people kind of reading between the lines of the latest privacy policy update and making sure that their microphone's not being transmitted to people they don't know. So that's privacy. The next one is identity. And so I'm going to start with a quote. Having two identities for yourself is an example of a lack of integrity. And this, of course, is a quote by Mark Zuckerberg. So I think he actually does believe this to be true. And so this is the avatar system, the avatar model that Facebook is pursuing, where they basically seed your avatar off of photos that they also have, of course, and then they use that to generate an avatar for you, and they highly encourage you to use an avatar that represents your physical self. And that's tied to your, you know, Facebook identity and your real name. And, you know, this is kind of the world that they're trying to build for us, where you have one identity, you have one name, you have one representation of yourself, and it's based upon how you look physically. And that's the future that they're, as best I can tell, they're trying to build. So I don't really agree with this at all. I think this is actually a really terrible idea. So I think, you know, I think social software, not just in mixed reality, but also just the social software we have today, like social media, should facilitate people to be able to sort themselves out. You know, you shouldn't always have to be on the record as your singular identity whenever you say anything on the internet. And so to steal some ideas from Joe Edelman here, these are some attributes that I think are desirable in any social system, and I think are important to get right for social mixed reality. It should be low stakes. You should have high sense of agency. There should be practice spaces for you to explore your values. And you know, these are things that we're not seeing get built right now out of Menlo Park. So this is stuff that I think is really important to get right. You know, I did a random search for Facebook Spaces screenshots, and I grabbed this one. And like, you know, it's fun, they're under the water, they're playing around, but I mean, if you think about what this is really showing us is that I know these people's names, I know what they probably look like in real life, I could probably get a sense of what they were doing here, and this is like the only option, right? This is the default. This is like what you get, like if you are using this very early prototype they have. And so, you know, the opportunity here is to make it so that this isn't the option, that, you know, if you do have a screenshot of yourself in Facebook Spaces, that it's not going to be something that like has actually worse self-identifying information in it than a physical photo does. So I thought that was kind of striking to see. So I think we should be free to choose our identity, our embodiment, and our representation in social mixed reality, and that we should be able to associate with other people in private contexts that we can prove are private, right? We can prove that they're private. We can prove that they can go off. We can go off the record, and we can prove that we can do so anonymously if we mutually choose to be off the record anonymous. And we should be free to act with agency in low-stakes environments so that we can understand the full blast radius of our actions, right? So it should be completely aware to us at all times, like what's the context, like how are our actions going to affect other people. So if I haven't convinced you already that this is troubling, so Oculus just launched their first version of Oculus Venues, which is causing a bit of a stir because this is the first time they're forcing people to log in with Facebook for an Oculus app. And so there was this huge amount of drama on the internet. And so the response that Oculus/Facebook had was that Facebook login helps them keep venues safe since people's conduct is associated with their authentic identity. And so if you really unpack what this is saying is, first that Facebook, by tying your real identity to your actions in VR, they see this fundamentally as a deterrence, right? So like that they see this as a way to keep you from acting in accordance with their TOS or whatever it is. And so I think that, in the absence of source code and visibility on things of how it works, you should basically assume that when you're using mixed reality with Facebook, that your social presence is being mediated by them, that your behavior is being monitored to some degree so that they can enforce TOS. Because if they weren't monitoring it, they wouldn't be able to say this, right? Like they wouldn't be able to actually. Even if they do have a reporting mechanism, they clearly must have a way to verify the claims in the report. So I think, and this is just the beginning, but I think this is a trend that is a little bit disturbing that falls out when you have this singular identity concept. And so for Hubs, we have no central account required. We might add an account mechanism later if it is needed for enabling certain features, but we think it's important you don't have to have an account to be able to meet with other people in mixed reality. We think it's important you have the ability to have a flexible identity. You can choose how you look and what identity you take on in a given context. And then we have plans later in the year to start working on avatars. And needless to say, we're going to be taking a fundamentally different approach than the one I was talking about. So the next area is access. And so this is about concerns I have about the kind of constraints people are that are being built around that are going to fundamentally prevent different kinds of access to this medium if it turns out to be an important thing for people. So these are kind of the usual shenanigans whenever there's like a new platform, right? So we've got app stores cropping up, and we've got these closed ecosystems forming. And we've got people having to be content gatekeepers. So if I want to make an app to meet with my friend, I have to submit it to Oculus overlords or whoever, and they have to give me the thumbs up that it's okay. And so, in the world of games and the world of apps, this is, I think, generally considered to be the status quo. But if we are talking about this fundamentally transformative medium where people are going to have the need to use it to be a person, then the fact that there could be gatekeepers to prevent you from using it how you want is potentially problematic. The next is typical platform lock-in, so exclusive titles and things like this. This is also pretty early to predict, but you could imagine in the limit, if there is a kind of large stratification of device support across the things you can do with those devices, then that becomes kind of a form of almost economic discrimination, right? Like I can't actually meet with people because I have a lower end piece of hardware. And if this becomes a fundamentally way for people to exist, then this kind of platform lock-in can be really, really damaging. And so the last one is this kind of rush to build these databases of centralized accounts. And so obviously Facebook, as I mentioned, wants you to use your Facebook account, but all these platforms that are trying to build these social mixed reality applications all want you to have a login. They all want to have that key in their database that they can use to know who you are. And so the reason this is problematic is just that, and we actually, those who have worked on this have seen this, people can build their whole lives in this medium, right? They can be somebody that actually doesn't leave the house, and their entire way they interact with humanity is through mixed reality. And so by having these centralized accounts, there's this huge hammer that can come down on them where they're basically taken away from the people they care about. And so this is also, a dangerous thing that if this becomes the way we spend time with others, that there's some person that can just click a button and prevent us from doing so. So, for Hubs, our stuff's open source. It's free to fork. It's free to self-host yourself if you don't like what it does. You can go your own way. You don't have to use our server or anything like that. And, we're not gatekeeping the kind of content that can go into it or anything like that. So that's why we're doing that. And so the last thing I wanted to touch on is design. And so for design, I want to cover just the idea that we're trying to design social systems. We've seen social media kind of be designed over time and all the pros and cons of the effects of those designs. But designing these systems is really hard, and building mixed reality social systems is a form of social system design. And so I think one unique thing about it is that if you just have accidental design where you don't actually think about things in particular and the design just falls out, from randomness, basically, and I personally am guilty of having this happen in prior projects with social mixed reality, this can actually harm people, especially if you're really successful, right? You could have something that you came up with on a weekend, and then you burned it into the thing, and then it turned out to take off, and lo and behold, there's all this unintentional damage to people's lives that you might not even realize until it's gotten to a certain level of scale. So I think it's really a dangerous, kind of scary thing if there's accidental design happening. And I think one specific accidental design decision that I see being made right now that can be highlighted, and so on the one hand we see evidence that this medium is really rewarding for a lot of people. They love the fact that they can be in there with people and be themselves. They have these really rich, meaningful interactions that they wouldn't be able to have in person for whatever reason. But then on the other hand, we have all these stories of people being terrified to go into social VR spaces because they get harassed or they get physically abused by people. So how is it that the same medium is having these two radically different experiences? I've seen both in the extreme. And so, Jessica Outlaw did a survey here showing the kind of huge issue with social mixed reality harassment that's going on. And so I think it's important that we step back, though, and ask, is this something inherently about this that is a problem? And because we're so early, I think that this is actually falling out from a design decision that's not probably being made explicitly in a lot of cases. So I think this is about intentional versus unintentional co-presence, right? And so intentional co-presence is when, before I go in and join a room with people in mixed reality and become socially present with them, I want full situational awareness. I want to know who they are. I want to know what we're doing. I want to know what's going on in that room. I want to have full intent to be in there before I actually enter the room. And the unintentional co-presence is kind of, there's a big red button. I go over, I hit it. The screen goes black. And I see now that I'm surrounded by 50 people. I have no idea who they are, and they all start yelling at me. Right? And so basically, the latter is actually what the majority, except one, just kind of is the default path you go through. You effectively end up just with a bunch of random people. And I think it's important to realize that that's a design, right? That's a design thing. That's not a medium thing. And so we should be careful and realize that there's probably opportunities to correct some of these problems by doing a better job of design. And Facebook Spaces actually, it turns out, is the only one that I know of that has traction, at least, that basically is focused on this sense of intentional co-presence, and that's why the asterisk in a lot of these surveys is nobody gets harassed in Facebook Spaces because you're meeting with people that you are connected with on Facebook, and it's not a random person, right? So I think that that's an important thing, and so for us, we're focused on intentional co-presence. So that's why we have this link sharing mechanism. The link is not, you can't guess the link, and the hope is that that will help mitigate a lot of these problems. But of course, we also backstop it by in-game safety tools where you can block people and mute people soon and prevent them from entering your personal space. But I think if those are being used, you've kind of already lost, right? You've kind of already done something wrong in your design, and so those should generally have minimal usage. And of course, we're trying to do our best to try to think hard about the design decisions we make and how they're going to affect people if we're successful in being a big project that a lot of people use. So I wanted to talk about, why I think Mozilla must lead in this space. I think there's a lot of work going on, and each individual project I think makes me nervous in different ways in terms of where the world ends up if they're the ones that are super successful. There's a lot of danger ahead in these dimensions, and probably more. I could probably go on and on. But in general, if we want to lead, I think the first question you might ask is how can we actually win? if there's both big companies and startups and VC-funded companies. And I think the thing I realized, especially working with my team over the last couple of months, is that one of the best ways to actually have a chance to win is to know something that actually ends up being true that others haven't really realized yet. And I think we actually do know something that's true that like nobody else, like other people in this space would just kind of laugh. And I think that is that if we do have something that's really good that actually works, that users will choose to use the web for this stuff. I think there's an opportunity for us to carve that out, and we can see in our early work that there's just like large things that are like better by doing it on the web inherently. And I think this is a really powerful lever for us to have a chance to win. I mentioned some of them, maximizing these things, and these are about not just user choice, but I think just the natural flow that people will move towards the web just because these things are better, and they'll just go there. So I think we have an opportunity to kind of get out ahead of some of this stuff. So I think Mozilla is uniquely positioned to make the web the choice that people make for getting together online, where getting together is now going to be this much more real sense of getting together in the future. And so, that's mostly my talk. So, we launched Hubs back in a really preview version back in April. It's a very modest beginning, but these guys did an amazing job. The technical achievements, the content we put together, it was really, really great to see this stuff all kind of come together into a cohesive thing that I think really pushes the limits of what you can do with a lot of these technologies that Mozilla and everyone have been working on for so long. So we're kind of the very top of that application layer, but it speaks to the immense amount of work that's gone into the browser over the last several years. But I think, fundamentally what we have now is kind of this glimmer and an existence proof of a potential future, right? So the thing, if you can take what we have now and kind of imagine that future versus the other stuff, it's profoundly different. It's profoundly different. And so I think that's what's really exciting about it is that, this actually provides a counterexample to what's going on. And, in a lot of ways, I'm kind of reminded of the early days when the original Phoenix came out, right, where the web was just kind of getting its footing, and here comes Microsoft. They're going to just own the whole thing. They're baking it into everything, and we're going to just be on the Microsoft web. And I think we're kind of like in a similar kind of stage right now where there's a few big people that are kind of making these really, really broad stroke decisions, and there needs to be a thing to show. This doesn't have to be the way, even if it's a small kind of thing to start. I think that's kind of where I hope that we look back on as what we've done. So, I think this is our existence proof and our glimmer of what we could potentially have as a future. And, I think the question is, what's the alternative, right? We have to try to do it. So, thanks everybody, and I hope this was a good talk for you guys.